So, I think this is the only time I'm ever going to say thank God that they decided to make this first competition so early into the year. Because I love team building. I think that team building is the second most interesting thing to do in these formats other than the actual fights themselves. So, before I gush into it too much in this intro, let's just cut right here so that we can talk about it later on. It's later on! So, there are a few roles that a Pokemon can fill in your team. Not necessarily that you need it, but something that does help you if you have it. Before I keep talking, let me preface something. When I bring up Pokemon that I think are good in this team building exercise, I consider anything lower than an 80 base stat to be not worth it, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a Pokemon with a stat lower than 80 is a bad Pokemon. It just means that that stat might not be what you want to put the most effort into. Anyway, let us continue on. So we have a Sweeper, a Glass Cannon, a Tank, a Wall, a Support, a Sub-Support, and so many other things that a Pokemon can fill in your team. Those are just 6, surprisingly enough. But you don't need just those, or you can make a team of all those, which I honestly wouldn't recommend. It wouldn't be too good for some of these. But let's go into Sweepers and Glass Cannons first. So I'm grouping these two together because depending on who you talk to, they're technically the same thing. But I tend to separate them based on the fact that even though they have the same trope, which is a decently high speed stat and a decently high attack or special attack stat, Sweepers tend to have a semi-decent defense that can help them survive a bit, whereas a Glass Cannon has absolutely no defenses whatsoever, and thus is high risk, high reward. Glass Cannons tend to be a little bit stronger and faster than a Sweeper is, but a Sweeper is also able to, survive a little bit longer. So it depends on what you want to choose. I wouldn't really suggest having both on the same team, but I can't really say anything. It's your choice to make your team. A good Sweeper that I'm currently thinking of is Crocodile. Crocodile has a pretty good support ability as well in Intimidate, while having a pretty high attack and speed stat, while also having, decent defenses across the board with HP defense and special defense. Whereas a Glass Cannon that I can think of right now is Mega Beedrill, which, just look at its stats for a moment. I'm putting up the stats right now, just look at those. Tell me that that's not a definition of a Glass Cannon. Come on. Come on, it's right there. Next, I'm going to say Support. So, Support Pokemon tend to have a decent status move pool, which is anything like Burning, Sleep, Poison, something like that they can use against your opponent. A really good Pokemon used for Support is Whimsicott, because Whimsicott has a decently high speed stat and also has Prankster, which makes moves that don't do damage go first. Mostly. So, with a Whimsicott, you tend to see Tailwind, you might see Leech Seed. There's just so many options that you can have in a support Pokemon, not even in just Whimsicott, just in any support Pokemon, that, honestly, I think that a support Pokemon is actually a necessity in most teams. Not in all teams, but in most teams you should have a support. A sub-support, however, is a Pokemon that, even though they can support, also has a pretty decent, let's say, attack or special attack stat to also do some damage as well. Togekiss is a pretty decent example of this, because Togekiss has a really high special attack stat, but also a really high special defense stat, and a pretty good support and special move pool. So, in theory, you can make Togekiss whatever you want. Now, Walls and Tanks. Another thing that some people would say, oh, these are the same thing, why are you considering them to be different? So, a wall is something that has amazing defenses and just can't do anything else but defend. Maybe do some supporting, but they're mostly there just to take the hits. Whereas a tank can take hits and is pretty often than not able to deal the damage back as well. So, Fortress, for example, or Shuckle as well, are two Pokemon that are walls. They have amazing defense and special defense, but they can't do anything else really. Whereas Ferrothorn is a Pokemon that I consider to be a tank, because it has a really good defense stat, but also has a really good attack stat, and thus can attack back if you really wanted it to. Some people don't want their Hyreztrom to have an attacking move, but it depends on who you talk to. So let's talk about some options that you have. For example, one Pokemon might be seen to be a sweeper or a glass cannon, but can be used as a support. Like, there are so many Pokemon in the game that it's not possible for one Pokemon to fit in only one trope other than Mega Beedrill, because Mega Beedrill's a bit glass cannon-y. For example, Gengar. Gengar has a really high speed and special attack stat, but also has a really good support move pool, and thus can be used as pretty much anything. It's like a jack-of-all-trades Pokemon, if you really wanted to consider it. But then there's the complete opposite, like Mega Beedrill and Weavile, I would say. Weavile's pretty fast, but its typing is not good for it, because fighting types are so... Like, the fighting type move, because it has 5... I think it hits 5 types super effectively, is so useful that having a Weavile, it's basically there to fake out and then die. Which brings us into moves for team building. So, when you're creating a Pokemon, whether it's a sweeper or a support or whatever, not only do you have to consider the stats, you also have to consider the moves that you're going to teach them. I mean, movesets are really important, especially in VGC, where, just a quick thing, always have Protect. Protect is a move that is pretty much essential in VGC because it's a doubles thing. So if you expect your Pokemon to be attacked by Fake Out or like to be targeted doubly, Protect is pretty good. So that's why it's on most Pokemon. You don't necessarily need it on all, even though I'm saying it's pretty essential. Some Pokemon that use Choice Scarfs or Choice Bands or any of the Choice items, just there's no reason for them to have Protect because Choice items lock you in. So, you know, but your support Pokemon should have something like Thunder Wave or Will-O-Wisp or Tailwind or anything that's really, really useful to the team that can really hinder your opponent. Whereas Sweepers and Glass Cannons should have a decent coverage of moves. I think that they should have a stab move, like something that is the same type as them. So let's go back to Crocodile. Crocodile should have Earthquake and probably Crunch or Foul Play, in my opinion. Then it would have Protect, and then let's say Rock Slide or Stone Edge for the coverage. Now, you might not want to build it like that. You might not want to build a Pokemon like Crocodile at all. You can build a Pokemon to be however you want it to, technically. Just consider the stats and how its moves are set out, because obviously if you want to make, let's say you want to make Kangaskhan a support, that's not going to work. Kangaskhan is there to do damage, especially if it's Mega. So, things to consider. Things to consider. Another thing to consider when doing team building is items. So, a really big rule in VGC is that no Pokemon on your team are allowed to hold the exact same item. So that means you can't have a Gengar and a Togekiss both holding leftovers. You can have items that have a similar or the exact same effect, for example, Black Sludge on a poison type and leftovers, but you can't have the exact same item. So it does also make you consider how you want a Pokemon to, keep going, in a way. Like, Glass Cannons and Sweepers tend to have Life Orbs, because Life Orbs make them do just a little bit extra damage, but they can also carry, let's say, a Choice Band to do that extra damage as well, and actually have a bigger boost, but only be locked into one move at a time before it swaps out. There's a whole lot of items that I could recommend, like leftovers are pretty much a necessity, like I just said a choice item. You don't necessarily need a choice item, like I personally don't like to use them, but that's just me. You can do whatever you want with a Pokemon, like, I love team building so much because there's so much potential for nearly every Pokemon. This leads me, however, to a bit of an issue within this current metagame, which is that nearly every single Alolan Pokemon is slow. Like, you know how I said earlier on that a base 80 stat for me is what is considered decent and anything else is probably not worthwhile? Yeah, this is where the Alolan Pokemon have a bit of an issue, because a lot of them have, let's say, actually, hold on. The average is a base 60 speed of all of the Alolan Pokemon, which isn't good at all. This is where Trick Room comes in. I'm sure that most people that follow TCG or VGC absolutely hate the words Trick Room because they hear it all the time. But Trick Room, honestly, is a really good move to have, especially in this metagame, because of how slow Pokemon are. For those of you who don't know, which, honestly, if you've been playing Pokemon this long and you don't know what Trick Room is, I don't know what to tell you. Trick Room essentially makes slow Pokemon move fast and fast Pokemon move last. So let's say you had a Weavile, a Crocodile, a Shuckle, and a Snorlax on the field. Because Crocodile and Weavile are pretty fast Pokemon, they would actually go last when in a Trick Room, whereas Shuckle, being the slowest of those 4 Pokemon, would be the Pokemon to go first. A Shuckle that probably has Power Split and is in a Trick Room is rather terrifying, but Shuckle's not really good, in my opinion. It has amazing defenses, but it works on gimmicks, so I think that's it. That's it for this episode. I'm happy that this is the longest episode so far, because I love team building so much. And I actually expect the TCG team building to be a lot longer, because there's a little bit more depth to it. Like, there's so many things to consider with VGC team building, but then there's like probably double to consider with TCG team building, in my opinion. But yeah, that's it. So, have a nice day. I will see you next week for the next episode, and I am sorry for the previous episode being released on Sunday. This was supposed to be released on Monday. I don't know why I thought having to cut down what was 25 minutes of audio into a 16-minute episode, which I still have to make more on, was going to be a good idea. Why do I do this? I need to work on everything. But it happens because I am horrible with timing. So, yay! Goodbye!